One of the movies that I watched while growing up was Shrek 2, and I always thought that it was a good movie. But now, with the both of us nearing our 20s, I decided it was time to give it a rewatch. Shrek 2 is a masterpiece of a movie, from its story, to its characters, from its visuals, to its music. All of it just comes together to make the perfect sequel that is Shrek 2. And much like Ogres, this movie has layers. Oh, and spoiler warning for this video, but to be honest, you had 20 years to watch this movie. This is like the equivalent of me talking about the end of the Titanic. Spoiler alert, it sinks. Shrek 2 starts off with a perfect representation of what a sequel should be, which is building off of the events of the movie before it. Shrek 2 begins with Chris Evans on his way to save Fiona from her tower in the first movie. But oh no, his princess is in another castle and turns out to be with Shrek on their honeymoon. Their honeymoon is great because it solidifies the events of the first movie and makes Shrek's efforts in that movie actually worthwhile. Oh, and it also starts the sequel movie from an extremely logical point, right after the first movie. This solidification of the first movie makes even more sense when you realize that Accidentally in Love is playing in the background, perfect for Shrek and Fiona's situation where they accidentally fall in love in the first movie. When their honeymoon ends and they return to the swamp, they find Donkey relatably depressed and kick him out, but end up being greeted at their door by the king's royal messengers. So they go to Far Far Away, a mix between fairy tales and Hollywood, which they were invited to by Fiona's mom and dad, the king and queen. And man, does this place have an awesome intro. You've got Funky Town playing in the background, perfectly representing Far Far Away as it really is a funky town to be in. In the opening scene alone, you've got Farbucks for all of your coffee needs, a Burger Prince to satisfy your appetite, or maybe a Baskin Robin Hood for a good dessert. The references found in this movie are great as they really make this film fun, sort of like an I Spy game to find each time you watch it, which makes you want to watch it more to find the next reference. But what's not fun is everybody being disgusted by our ogre couple. This is directly followed by an amazing scene where Fiona and Shrek are talking and their sentences are being finished by the king and queen, and vice versa. Both couples share the same thoughts about one another, creating a connection between ogres and humans while also dividing them further with the negativity being spoken. This scene also foreshadows how the rest of the movie is going to play out, with Fiona and the queen being more optimistic while the men are more pessimistic. They then have a nice, calm dinner and play a game where they say each other's names.
Shrek!
Fiona!
Mom! Harold!
Donkey!
Which for some reason makes Fiona upset. She's crying in her room and all of a sudden, poof, the fairy godmother shows up and gives her a nice little Just Dance session right before leaving. This is where it's revealed that upgraded Farquaad was picked out by the king and queen themselves and was supposed to be the one to marry Fiona, not Shrek. The king is then picked up by the fairy godmother and is told to force Fiona to marry Chris Evans by any means necessary, resulting in him hiring our lovable hairball, Puss in Boots, to get rid of Shrek. We then cut to Shrek snooping in Fiona's old diary, as he starts to become insecure in his ogreness and his abilities as a replacement for Chris Charming, which is a great setup for the rest of the movie and his future actions. The repetition of Prince Evan's name solidifies in Shrek's mind that from the beginning of Fiona's life, it was always supposed to be the prince to marry her, and never Shrek, making Shrek doubt himself in not just being a good husband, but being the good image of one. This moment is quickly interrupted by the king, making plans with Shrek to meet in the morning. Shrek leaves to go to the meeting spot, but instead sees... Oh no, Puss. What happened to you? You see, Puss's first design is a bit off-putting. Now, this movie did come out in 2004, and for the majority of the time, the visuals aged pretty well. Lighting is still pretty decent by today's standards, movement feels a lot more fluid than it did in the first movie, which is easily seen during Fiona and the fairy godmother's first time meeting. The style of this movie is amazing as well, like the opening scene with Prince Evans galloping on his horse to save the princess. Oh, and the humans in this movie are a great step up from the first movie, now having better hair interaction, actual realistic facial features, not Farquaad. This movie just looks good, which is extremely impressive all these years later, but none of this goodness applies to Puss. What the hell am I looking at? This is nightmare fuel. No wonder he was so feared in this movie. The fuzzy sleep paralysis demon would make me quit any fight too. But continuing with the story, Puss fails to off Shrek and joins their team, while informing Shrek of the king's plan to get rid of him. Shrek then thinks of how to appease everyone, with his solution to go and see the fairy godmother in hopes of getting her help. Puss then... He does the thing! He does the thing! Okay, forget what I said. No more sleep paralysis demon. Puss's terrible design is now the best in this movie. I mean, look at him. Who would not want to hug him? After talking to the fairy godmother and being told of how terrible his life is supposed to be, Shrek and the gang sneak into her potion room and grab a potion to give them all a happily ever after. They escape the building and take the potion, but all it does is... Upset at the potion's failure, the group takes a rest in a barn to wake up as... Oh my god. have my babies. So now that Shrek is the guy from the B movie, they decide to commit acts of terrorism on Far Far Away and then go to see Fiona. But whoa, hold it. Chris Hemsworth is acting as if he is Shrek after taking the potion, convincing Fiona to stay away from the person who is actually Shrek. Shrek then overhears that the king and the fairy godmother are planning to give Fiona a love potion to fall in love with Jaime Lannister. Shrek runs away but is quickly arrested, and Donkey makes a reference that is sadly still relevant today.
Police brutality! Police brutality!
After being broken out of jail, they get to the castle and break into the ball, all to the song I Need a Hero, an absolute banger of a song for one of the best scenes in cinematic history. And it's perfect as Fiona needs her hero, Shrek. But when Shrek gets to Fiona, it is too late. She has already kissed Prince Hemsworth and solidified the love potion, or would have if the king decided to actually give it to her. It turns out the king never gave Fiona the love potion, allowing Shrek to stay with Fiona and for everyone to get a happily ever after. Well, except for the fairy godmother because she died. Oh, and Chris Evans because he has negative riz. And of course this movie ends with the absolutely fire song that is Livin La Vida Loca, which is one of the best songs to play in Just Dance 4. So what makes this movie a masterpiece, you may ask? Well, what makes Shrek 2 a masterpiece is how it, 1, is a fantastic movie dealing with real life issues all in proper ways, 2, is a perfect sequel to the movie released before it, and 3, has 2 wonderful messages that can easily be applied to our everyday lives. Luckily, our first 2 topics are both answered by the fact that this is a good sequel movie building off of the events of the first movie. Shrek 2 is actually a natural step in life, where in the first movie he met and married Fiona, he now has to deal with the natural issues that occur with that marriage, such as the rough patches that occur in a marriage. This natural progression from the first movie to the second makes Shrek 2 a perfect sequel as it builds on Shrek's character while incorporating his growth from the previous movie. Shrek and Fiona's rough patch is sparked by their conflicting views on who they are and who they should be seen as. Shrek believes that he is and always will be an ogre, so he should act and be treated as one, while Fiona believes that even though they are still ogres, they should be respected and treated just like anyone else. These same views are also seen in the King and Queen, yet again tying back to their first encounter when finishing each other's
Sandwiches.
That's what I was gonna say.
It shows how Shrek and Fiona are foils to the King and Queen, just different in the perspective of one side being ogres and the other humans. Throughout Shrek 2, the only dynamic character is really Shrek himself, where at the beginning of the movie he is quite insecure with who he is as an ogre, and at the end he's able to realize that ogre or not, it is his actions that defines who he really is, which leads us into the messages seen in Shrek 2. Shrek 2 has 2 messages, those being accepting yourself and not judging a book by its cover. These messages are perfectly portrayed by Shrek and Fiona's conflict along with Shrek and society's conflict during the movie. Throughout the movie, we see moments where Shrek doubts his abilities as a husband and ultimately ends up blaming it on the fact that he is an ogre. He is unwilling to accept himself as he only sees being an ogre as a flaw, whereas we learn at the end of the movie that that is not the case. Fiona sees it as what makes Shrek so special, teaching him to accept the fact that he is an ogre and to embrace it rather than reject it. And in the end, Shrek also wants to prove to others that even though on the outside he is an ogre, on the inside he is probably closer to being human than many of us, only wanting to sacrifice who he is to make the love of his life happy. Shrek 2 is an amazing movie through and through, and is easily one of the best animated movies of all time. And I don't mean it metaphorically, or rhetorically, or poetically, or theoretically, or in any other fancy way. I am amazed. Straight up. Shrek 2 is the pinnacle of animation, containing a wonderful story, a fantastic cast of characters, a superb music selection, and is all surprisingly able to still look good today. Shrek 2 is a masterpiece and is the definition of a perfect sequel.